Welcome to Competing Cultural Theories. This PowerPoint lecture is an overview of the ways that you can think about different aspects of cross-cultural or intercultural communication. This will really just sort of skim the surface. There is a lot more theory involved in it. And one of the frustrating things about this is that since there's so many different types of cultures, we can't possibly go into every aspect of every culture and how it might be different. And it's also difficult and sometimes a problem to even try to group cultures or say that all of them are of a certain type. But there are some theoretical frameworks for looking at different cultures and how they approach communication tasks and interpersonal tasks, and that's pretty much what we're going to look at here. And then the other documents that are for you to read get into how this relates to the business practices as well. There have been many attempts to understand cultural differences over the last 50 years. There have been ways of categorizing different cultures, different types of cultures, and then what we're also very aware is that nonverbal communication is highly important to the ways of understanding cross-cultural or intercultural communication. And the one thing I want to say about the nonverbal is that they're not just different things people do, they're rooted in very old sometimes and deep differences of thought, not just something that people happen to do on the outside. And of course, the whole other thing is that most cultures speak a different language, and you really can't fully embrace a culture until you study its language and understand some of the aspects of it. So I encourage you to study a foreign language because it can make a big difference in your ability to communicate and understand other types of people. Now, one of the primary persons who have studied cultural dimensions or different types of cultures was a man named Hofstede, who in the 60s and 70s did a lot of research based on thousands of IBM employees. Now, this may seem strange, but IBM means International Business Machines, and in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even later, IBM was the Apple, the Microsoft of that time, and so their companies were all over the world. Their branches were all over the globe, a truly international company, and so they obviously had times of cultural conflict because of being in Africa and Asia and South America and Europe and in North America. So Gert Hofstede came up with 5, and then later a 6th one was added of research on of the dimensions of these cultures and what made them different. And so you can go to these two sites, and I would definitely recommend the YouTube one where she will explain the basics between Hostede's cultural dimensions. And this is sort of, again, something you really need to know in whatever field you're in to sort of see the power distance, the feminine, masculine, et cetera, that he uses. One of the primary ways of thinking about cultures is the difference between low context and high context cultures. And you pretty much can't get out of college without understanding these. So I would encourage you, not just for the sake of the test, but the midterm, but also for just basically understanding cultural differences, that you get this differentiation between low context and high context. To some extent, you can think of low context as being the individualistic cultures, and the high context as being the collectivist cultures. That's not entirely true, but it's close enough that you can that can help you to understand them. So in low context cultures, there is a need to explain the rules. Rules are explicit. We have, for example, in a culture or a company that has a low context culture, they're going to have a very um, definite set of printed rules and manuals and codes of conduct and things like that. Think about the United States and how many law books we have and how thick the for example, the Affordable Care Act bill was. It was 10,000 pages. Okay, that's a good example that we are a low context culture. Whereas in a high context culture, rules are implicit and there's no need to explain them because everybody understands them. Now, this may seem very strange to us. If you've ever been in a situation where it seemed like you were the only person who didn't understand the rules, that might give you a sense. But when the whole country is like that, you can kind of get the sense of how an outsider might feel. But the more collectivistic a country is or culture is, the less need there is for explicit, clear, written down rules because everybody just knows them. In a low context culture, competence is valued more than position or status, and competence is supposed to be the basis for that. We call individualistic cultures many times meritocracies. You get where you are because of what you know and how hard you work. Now, we know that while that's an ideal in the United States, it always doesn't work that way because we know of people who've gotten jobs because of who they were and who they knew. But the value is that competence and hard work are valued more than who you're related to. In a high context culture, it may be possibly that position and status are valued more than competence. And that's not to say that the people are incompetent, but that their relationships to others and their place on the hierarchy is more important than their competence. Nepotism is not frowned on in many collectivist or high context cultures. And if you say, what's nepotism? That's hiring your relatives. It's forbidden in many places in the United States because that's seen as not fair. I can't, for example, hire my son to teach in my department because even though he's qualified, he's my son, he can't work for me. So that kind of thing. You can't, your wife or your husband can't work for you in the university system or in many companies. So that's an example where that would not be as big a problem in a high context culture. Also in low context cultures, objective data is supposed to be valued over subjective relationships. Therefore, low context cultures are seen as, at least they feel themselves, are less open to corruption. Whereas in high context cultures, subjective relationships are valued over objective data. And where it says therefore seen as distant, that means in terms of power distance. Many high context or collectivist cultures are more comfortable with distance and power distance between levels in a hierarchy than would be low context cultures. We want more equality in our organizations. In low context, often the business and social relationships are seen as separate, and this is where we get into the business aspect of this. Whereas in high context cultures, the business and social relationships often overlap. You are supposed to go out and socialize. You were supposed to spend a lot of time talking about relationship and family before you get to the business. Americans in their business have had to learn this. We tend to be, let's cut to the chase, get to the deal, and that's not seen as appropriate in high context cultures, such as in Asia. I don't want to broad brush. Not all cultures in Asia are going to be exactly the same, and that's a mistake that many Americans make. India is not Korea, China is not Japan, and you never, ever, ever want to confuse those. That's extremely offensive. But we do tend to see Asian cultures as more high context and collectivistic. In low context cultures, workers rely on detailed background explanation, which makes sense considering the first point. But in high context, the workers just know what they're supposed to do, and they're able to intuit that and pick it up from the fact that everybody's much more the same and collectivistic. They may not feel the necessity due to the high context to have very detailed explanations. In low context cultures, meetings have fixed agendas and are at a long-term notice, whereas in a high context culture, and keep in mind that it may be that a company or an organization, even though it's in the United States, can be high context, especially if their origins are from a high context country. In high context cultures, meetings can be called quickly and everyone expected to be there, no exceptions, and they accept that. So they'll say, we're having a meeting in 10 minutes. Well, I had something else planned. No, you're there. It's very different than we feel it. We control our time more in a low context. In a low context culture, information is centralized and controlled, whereas in high context cultures or companies, the information is shared with the organization. And we tend in our countries to not share the information. We tend to, sort of like the military, things are top secret. Okay. A similar, and this is, I'm showing this to kind of get the idea that these various schemas for understanding cultural differences are have a lot of overlap. Globe researchers came up with these characteristics of cultures that differentiate them, that make them different: uncertainty avoidance, in-group collectivism, humane orientation, power distance, that one is in Hofstede's, gender egalitarianism, that's in Hofstede's, the idea being are male and female roles very different and distinct versus there's a lot of equality, performance orientation, future orientation, assertiveness, and institutional collectivism. So that's another way of thinking about cultural differences. And this is a diagram that shows what countries fit into each of these categories. And it's interesting that if you find the United States on this, it's in with some other countries that you might not expect us to be in there with. It's interesting that Israel is there, and we have a lot of ties to Israel, even though it's a Middle Eastern country. It's more American than others are, Americanized. Okay, and then Trompenaar and Hampton Turner had a similar sort of way of breaking the dimensions down of cultures. So I show these just to show that there is overlap, and in understanding how cultures are different, that they're not. It's not a difference of better or worse, of course. It's just a difference of how they approach various life needs and situations. So, as you look at these, you might want to ask yourself, what common themes do we see in these categorizations? Well, we see the issue of gender, a male, female, and however that's interpreted. We see the sense of time, past, present, future. That's going to make a difference. We see how the group feels about individual versus group. I remember Dr. Min, who's Chinese and teaches in our department, and she teaches intercultural communication. She taught me a lot of things at first. She said that when Chinese students come to the United States, they can't stand macaroni and cheese. And I told her, well, that's because they never had my mother's. But she said after they've been here about a year, they like it. And they think it's gross when they first come. And I said, well, it's probably because they're eating that stuff out of the box, not real macaroni and cheese, but homemade. But she also said that in China they do not have an expression for "I don't feel comfortable with that." And I thought that was very interesting, that they just don't even have an expression just to talk about their own feelings about a decision or what they're being forced to do. They just go along with it. So, so the difference between the group and the individual, very big. Like I said, power distance. Are hierarchical. Should an organization have a lot of layers and ranks and levels, or should it be more across the board and not so much? So these are some similarities that you will see in these categorizations of culture. Now, all of this relates very much to nonverbal communication. And when we talk about nonverbal communication, this is pretty much the breakdown. Occasionally you'll see another one in there, like smell and silence is another one, but these are pretty much the ones that are seen as the breakdown, the categories of nonverbal communication. Body language, which is everything from the chin down, okay? That's also called kinesics. Facial expression or affect, which is everything from the chin up. And this includes what's sometimes called oculesics, which is eye behavior and how your eyes work or don't work. I taught interpersonal communication last semester, and we studied deception. And one way you can tell if a person is really smiling is that their eyes are smiling. People who are fake smiling, their eyes don't smile. Thought that was interesting. Then there's space. Cultures can differ very much in terms of space and how close they get to each other, as well as touch. Americans like their space, their bubbles. Other cultures are more likely to want to touch you or be close to you, and it's hard for Americans, especially the more north you get. Southerners are a little more touchy than Northerners, but that's still a big difference between Americans and North Americans and other groups. We want our space. Think about when you get into an elevator, your first thing is to move as far away from people as you can. Touch, we have touch that it's allowed, and we have very, very strict rules about touch in our culture. And this is one place where we are high context, because you're just supposed to know these things. And only certain people can touch you in certain places. And only certain people can touch you for certain amounts of time and for certain purposes. So we're very, very particular about touch. Objectics, clothing, artifacts, markings, all kinds of earrings, etc. Time is a major one. This is one thing I've had to learn. I'm teaching an ESL class at my church, and English is a second language, and we have folks from the Middle East and Latin American countries, and they're just different with time than a typical North American. We're starting now. It's at 4:30. You better be here. That just doesn't work with them. They come when they come, and they want to stay later. They want to socialize. They just have a different view of time. And to be honest, after what these people are going through, they deserve it, because they're refugees and they've had some really, really bad stuff happen to them. So I just had to get over myself. And then paralanguage or vocalics is things such as how loud your voice is, the pitch of your voice, how fast you talk, things of that sort. Americans are known to be loud, and we are. When we're in foreign countries. So that's one thing you might want to think about, is don't be a loudmouth when you're in a foreign country, because you're going to look like an American anyway because of your dress. You don't want to make it look any worse. I try to look as European as possible when I'm outside of the United States. And some people might not like that, but I can get away with it. So those are different aspects of nonverbal communication. Like I said, silence and smell are two others that are often added to this list because smell has a certain meaning to people and silence has a meaning to people. So what does this mean? Recognize that cultural differences are deeply rooted. Just, the fact that an Indian person might bow or an Asian person might bow versus shaking hands, that's not just something they do because they feel like doing it. It is deeply, deeply ingrained in their religion, in their history, and their practices. And there's, the whole thing. The reason we shake hands is to show that we don't have a weapon. And that might seem strange, but that's where it came from. They bow out of deference, or respect. So it's a whole different way of thinking about things. Adaptation is a two-way street. You might feel that people if they're going to live in this country, they should just do everything like Americans, but we would probably not feel that way if we went to their country. Language is more than a layer of words over meaning. If you've ever studied a foreign language, such as Spanish or French or German, you know that you're not just learning new sets of words, you're learning a new way of thinking. I think the biggest one is gender. Most other languages, at least Romance languages, have gender for their words. So a book in Spanish is male, but a table is female. Why is that? Well, does that affect people? Why would a table be female and a book be male? What is that, sexist? What is that? It's an interesting question. And this is really my takeaway, you want to try to be as idiom-free, slang-free, and metaphor-free as possible with your language in professional settings. We use a lot of cliches and expressions and slang and idioms. We don't even know what they mean, what they're doing. And I have a list here. And this is a list of typical terms that Americans use, slang, metaphors, cliches, etc. And all of these are totally non-communicative to a person who is a second language speaker because they just don't communicate necessarily. You say you're as cool as a cucumber. Well, what's up with that? Well, actually, the reason is the cucumber will stay colder inside and cooler inside of itself than other vegetables. There's something about it. But, that's not going to communicate to somebody, especially if they don't even have cucumbers in their culture. So, when the fat lady sings, we have all these dumb expressions, and I'm guilty of using them too. So you want to avoid that. Those are some good. You could probably think of many, many more if we had to. So the differences, we often talk about cultural awareness, sensitivity, and competence, and this is just sort of a difference. Knowledge is the familiarization with selected cultural characteristics, history, values, belief systems, and behaviors of members of another ethnic group. And cultural awareness is developing sensitivity and understanding of another group. So you can have knowledge and not necessarily be sensitive and understanding. Cultural sensitivities means knowing the differences without assigning values. We're very quick to say, "Oh, we're better." We're just naturally ethnocentric, and that's, if you're sensitive, you're not going to be doing that. And then competence refers more to using all three of these by a person or organization to operate effectively. So the first three build and create the last one. So when you hear these terms, know that they're not all the same. So now you can read the other material that's posted for cultural communication and be prepared for questions about this on the exam, midterm exam.